In the cobblestone streets of Renaissance Florence, where power shifted like sand in an hourglass and fortunes were made and lost with the stroke of a pen, there lived a truth that transcended the marble halls of the Medici and echoed through the chambers of every ambitious soul: mastery over oneself preceded mastery over all else. This was not merely philosophy, it was survival distilled into its purest essence. The morning mist clung to the Arno River as Lorenzo walked through the awakening city, his mind churning with the weight of understanding that had come to him through years of observation, study, and bitter experience. He had witnessed princes fall not to external armies but to their own ungoverned appetites, had seen merchants lose empires built over generations to a single moment of weakness, and had observed how those who commanded themselves with iron discipline seemed to bend reality itself to their will. The concept that would later be crystallized in the works of political philosophy was already taking shape in his mind: the individual who destroys his weak self, who systematically eliminates every vestige of uncontrolled impulse, every surrender to base emotion, every capitulation to momentary pleasure at the expense of long-term dominance, becomes truly indestructible. For what weapon can an enemy wield against a man who has already conquered his greatest foe, himself? This understanding formed the foundation of what would become a comprehensive philosophy of power, one that recognized self-mastery not as an end in itself but as the essential prerequisite for all other forms of mastery. The weak self, that collection of immediate desires, emotional reactions, and undisciplined thoughts, represented not just a personal failing but a strategic vulnerability that enemies could exploit with devastating effectiveness. Lorenzo's observations extended beyond individual cases to the broader patterns of power that governed his world. He noticed that those who maintained power longest were not necessarily the strongest in terms of military might or the wealthiest in terms of material resources, but rather those who demonstrated the most complete control over their own nature. They were the ones who could wait when waiting served their interests, who could strike when striking was optimal, and who could endure suffering without allowing it to cloud their judgment or compromise their strategic vision. The destruction of the weak self required a systematic approach that began with recognition. One had to identify the specific manifestations of weakness within oneself with the same analytical precision that a military commander would use to identify vulnerabilities in a fortress. These weaknesses typically fell into predictable categories: the need for immediate gratification that prevented long-term planning, the emotional reactions that revealed one's true thoughts and intentions to opponents, the dependencies on external validation that gave others leverage over one's behavior, and the inability to act contrary to one's natural inclinations when strategic necessity demanded it. The process of elimination was neither quick nor comfortable. It required the methodical cultivation of habits that ran counter to natural human tendencies. Where the weak self sought comfort, the strengthened self embraced necessary discomfort. Where the weak self reacted emotionally, the controlled self responded strategically. Where the weak self revealed its intentions through expression and body language, the disciplined self maintained perfect inscrutability. Lorenzo understood that this transformation was not about suppressing human nature but about elevating it to its highest and most effective expression. The man who had conquered his weak self did not become emotionless, he became the master of his emotions, able to deploy them as tools when useful and set them aside when they served no purpose. He did not become incapable of desire, he became the architect of his desires, able to cultivate those that served his interests and eliminate those that did not. The practical applications of this philosophy extended into every aspect of life and leadership. In negotiations, the self-mastered individual held insurmountable advantages. While opponents revealed their positions through unconscious tells, emotional reactions, and the pressure of their own impatience, he remained a closed book, gathering information while revealing nothing, waiting for the optimal moment to strike with precision. His controlled demeanor itself became a weapon, unsettling those accustomed to reading others and gaining psychological advantage through the uncertainty he created. In the realm of personal relationships, self-mastery provided both protection and influence. Those who had not conquered their weak selves remained vulnerable to manipulation through their known desires and fears. They could be flattered, threatened, seduced, or intimidated because their reactions were predictable and their weaknesses visible. The self-mastered individual, by contrast, presented no such easy targets. His responses were calculated rather than automatic, his affections and enmities strategic rather than emotional, his loyalties based on advantage rather than sentiment. This did not mean becoming a cold, calculating machine devoid of human connection. Rather, it meant becoming the conscious architect of one's relationships, able to form genuine bonds when they served mutual benefit while remaining free from the emotional dependencies that could be exploited by those with malicious intent. The self-mastered individual could love, but his love was not a weakness; he could trust, but his trust was earned and contingent; he could show loyalty, but his loyalty was based on reciprocity and continued mutual benefit. The financial and material dimensions of self-mastery proved equally crucial. The weak self typically displayed its nature most clearly in relationship to money and material possessions. It sought immediate pleasures, made emotional purchases, and demonstrated status through conspicuous consumption, all of which created vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. Financial weakness often led to compromising positions, while material dependencies created leverage points that others could manipulate. The self-mastered individual approached wealth with the same strategic discipline he applied to all other aspects of life. Money became a tool for increasing power and options rather than an end in itself or a means to satisfy immediate desires. Material possessions were evaluated based on their utility rather than their ability to provide comfort or status. This approach created financial independence that translated directly into strategic independence, the ability to make decisions based purely on their merits rather than on financial pressure or material need. The transformation required constant vigilance and continuous refinement. The weak self did not surrender easily; it reasserted itself at moments of stress, fatigue, or success. Vigilance meant developing the ability to observe one's own thoughts and reactions with the detachment of an external analyst, catching the emergence of weaknesses before they could manifest in behavior and create vulnerabilities. Lorenzo's understanding deepened as he observed how external circumstances revealed the true state of individual self-mastery. Crisis situations stripped away pretenses and revealed whether someone had genuinely conquered their weak self or had merely succeeded in maintaining the appearance of control under favorable conditions. Those with authentic self-mastery remain steady under pressure, their judgment unimpaired by fear or excitement, their strategic thinking uncompromised by emotional turbulence. The concept of destruction was central to this philosophy, but it was destruction in service of creation. The weak self had to be systematically dismantled not out of self-hatred but out of recognition that its continued existence prevented the emergence of something far more powerful and effective. This destruction was analogous to the pruning of a tree, cutting away the parts that drained energy and resources without contributing to the overall strength and productivity of the organism. The process required remarkable honesty about one's own nature. Most people lived in comfortable self-deceptions, explaining away their failures and weaknesses rather than confronting them directly. The path to self-mastery demanded abandoning these comforting illusions in favor of brutal accuracy about one's actual capabilities, genuine motivations, and real weaknesses. Only through such honesty could one identify what needed to be eliminated and what needed to be strengthened. Physical discipline formed an essential component of this transformation. The body and mind were not separate entities but aspects of a unified system. Weakness in one manifested as weakness in the other. Physical comfort-seeking, lack of endurance, poor health habits, and inability to tolerate discomfort all translated into mental and strategic weaknesses that could be exploited. Conversely, physical discipline, conditioning, and the ability to function effectively under adverse conditions strengthened the entire system of self-control. The self-mastered individual developed what might be called strategic patience, the ability to endure present difficulties and forego immediate advantages in service of larger, long-term objectives. This patience was not passive waiting but active preparation, using time to strengthen one's position while opponents weakened themselves through impulsive actions and emotional decisions. The relationship between self-mastery and power became increasingly clear through Lorenzo's observations. Power was not something that could be safely grasped by those who had not first conquered themselves. The weak self, when given power over others, inevitably abused it in ways that ultimately led to its own destruction. History was littered with examples of rulers whose personal weaknesses had brought down not only themselves but entire kingdoms. True power required the ability to use authority judiciously, to resist the temptations that power presented, and to maintain strategic focus even when in positions of apparent safety. The self-mastered individual could be trusted with power because he was not at the mercy of the impulses and emotions that typically corrupted those in positions of authority. His exercise of power was calculated rather than emotional, strategic rather than personal, and, therefore, more likely to be effective and enduring. The concept extended beyond individual transformation to encompass entire organizations and societies. Groups led by self-mastered individuals displayed the same characteristics of strategic thinking, disciplined execution, and resistance to external manipulation. Conversely, organizations led by those who had not conquered their weak selves exhibited the predictable patterns of internal conflict, strategic confusion, and vulnerability to external influence. The transformation was never complete in the sense that constant vigilance remained necessary. The weak self was not eliminated once and for all but required ongoing suppression and redirection. This ongoing process, however, became easier over time as new habits replaced old ones and the benefits of self-mastery reinforced the motivation to maintain it. Lorenzo began to understand that the ultimate goal was not the elimination of human nature but its perfection. The self-mastered individual represented humanity at its most effective and powerful, not because he had abandoned his human characteristics but because he had brought them under conscious control and strategic direction. He became more human, not less, but a version of humanity that had evolved beyond the weaknesses that typically limited human potential. The philosophy that emerged from these observations would prove remarkably durable, applicable across cultures and centuries because it addressed fundamental aspects of human nature and the dynamics of power that remained constant despite changing external circumstances. The specific techniques might vary, the cultural expressions might differ, but the core principle remained: mastery over oneself was the prerequisite for all other forms of mastery. As the morning mist cleared from the Arno and the city came to full life around him, Lorenzo carried with him the understanding that would shape not only his own approach to life but would eventually influence countless others who recognized the truth embedded in his observations. The man who could destroy his weak self had indeed made himself indestructible, not because he had become physically invulnerable, but because he had eliminated the internal vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. This destruction was simultaneously an act of creation, bringing into being a version of oneself that was harder, more focused, more capable, and ultimately more free than the version that had existed before. Freedom, in this context, meant freedom from the tyranny of one's own uncontrolled impulses and emotions, a liberation that opened up possibilities for influence and achievement that were simply unavailable to those who remained slaves to their weak selves. The second phase of this understanding emerged through the practical application of these principles in the complex world of Renaissance politics and commerce. Lorenzo found himself testing these ideas against the harsh realities of a world where survival depended on one's ability to navigate treacherous alliances, economic uncertainties, and the constant threat of both visible and hidden enemies. The first major test came during a period of economic uncertainty that gripped Florence like a fever. Banks failed, trade routes were disrupted, and panic spread through the merchant class with the speed of plague. Lorenzo watched as men he had known for years, successful, respected individuals, crumbled under the pressure, their carefully constructed facades falling away to reveal the weak selves they had never truly conquered. Some responded with desperate gambling, throwing good money after bad and increasingly risky ventures driven by emotional panic rather than rational analysis. Others retreated into paralysis, unable to act decisively because their fear overwhelmed their judgment. Still others lashed out irrationally at partners, employees, and family members, their stress manifesting as uncontrolled anger that destroyed relationships they had spent years building. Lorenzo observed his own reactions with the analytical detachment he had cultivated. He noticed the initial stirrings of anxiety, the temptation to act hastily, the desire to seek comfort in familiar but potentially counterproductive patterns. But, rather than being controlled by these reactions, he used them as information. His anxiety told him that the situation was indeed serious and required careful attention. His temptation to act hastily warned him that he needed to slow down and think more carefully. His desire for comfort indicated that he was at risk of making decisions based on emotional needs rather than strategic advantage. The economic crisis became an opportunity to practice and refine the principles of self-mastery under extreme conditions. While others were driven to reveal their true thoughts and intentions through emotional reactions, Lorenzo maintained perfect inscrutability. Business partners and competitors could not read his level of concern, his financial position, or his strategic intentions. This uncertainty itself became a form of power, as others found themselves making assumptions and decisions based on incomplete information while he gathered intelligence about their true situations through their emotional reactions. He used the crisis as an opportunity to acquire assets at favorable prices from those whose emotional state prevented them from thinking clearly about value. Not out of malice, but out of recognition that someone would benefit from the dislocations, and it might as well be someone who could use those assets effectively. His offers were fair but firm, and his ability to act decisively while others hesitated gave him significant advantages. The crisis also revealed the importance of what he came to think of as strategic reserves, not just financial reserves, but reserves of energy, attention, relationships, and options that could be deployed when circumstances demanded. The weak self typically operated at or near capacity, using all available resources for immediate concerns and leaving nothing in reserve for unexpected challenges. The self-mastered individual, by contrast, maintained deliberate slack in all systems, understanding that true security came from having unused capacity that could be activated when needed. During this period, Lorenzo also refined his understanding of how self-mastery influenced his relationships with others. He noticed that people were naturally drawn to those who remained calm and controlled during turbulent times. His steady demeanor in the face of crisis made him a natural point of stability that others sought out, giving him access to information and influence opportunities that would not have been available to someone who was visibly struggling with their own emotional state. But he also learned to be cautious about this attraction. Some who sought him out were genuinely looking for wisdom and guidance, and these relationships could be mutually beneficial. Others, however, were seeking someone to lean on, to solve their problems for them, or to serve as an emotional crutch during difficult times. These parasitic relationships had to be carefully managed or avoided entirely, as they could drain his resources without providing corresponding benefits. The navigation of these relationship dynamics required subtle skills that complemented the more obvious aspects of self-mastery. He learned to project strength without arrogance, competence without condescension, and availability without vulnerability. These interpersonal skills were not manipulative in the crude sense but represented the external expression of internal discipline, the ability to manage not only his own emotional state but also the emotional dynamics of his interactions with others. As the economic crisis passed and stability returned to the city, Lorenzo found himself in a significantly stronger position than he had occupied before. This was not primarily due to any brilliant strategic insights or lucky decisions, but rather to his ability to maintain clear thinking and steady judgment while others were compromised by their emotional reactions to events. The crisis had served as a kind of natural selection process, weakening those who lacked self-mastery while strengthening those who possessed it. This experience led to a deeper understanding of how external challenges could be reframed as opportunities for demonstrating and developing self-mastery. Rather than seeing difficulties as problems to be avoided, he began to see them as testing grounds where the strength of his self-control could be measured and improved. This shift in perspective transformed his relationship with adversity from one of resistance to one of embrace, not because he enjoyed suffering, but because he recognized its value as a tool for development. The political dimensions of self-mastery became increasingly apparent as Lorenzo's business success brought him into contact with the power structures of the city. He observed that political effectiveness required the same fundamental skills as personal effectiveness, but applied in a more complex and dangerous environment where mistakes could have consequences extending far beyond one's immediate circle. Political actors who had not conquered their weak selves displayed predictable vulnerabilities that their opponents could exploit. Those motivated primarily by ego could be manipulated through flattery or insults. Those driven by greed could be controlled through financial incentives or threats. Those enslaved by their appetites could be compromised through the provision or withholding of their preferred pleasures. Those dependent on public approval could be influenced through the management of their reputation. The self-mastered individual in the political arena presented no such easy targets. His motivations were strategic rather than personal, his actions calculated rather than emotional, and his loyalties based on advantage rather than sentiment. This did not make him cold or inhuman, but it made him extremely difficult to predict, manipulate, or control through conventional means. Lorenzo began to understand that political power, like all forms of power, was fundamentally about the ability to influence others' behavior. Those who had not conquered their own weak selves were inherently limited in their ability to exercise such influence because their own behavior was itself influenced by forces beyond their conscious control. How could someone effectively direct others when he could not effectively direct himself? The most successful political actors he observed shared certain characteristics that reflected their self-mastery. They spoke little and listened much, revealed their intentions only when beneficial to do so, maintained relationships based on mutual benefit rather than personal affection, and demonstrated unwavering consistency in their core principles while remaining flexible in their tactical approaches. These individuals also understood the importance of what he came to call strategic mystery, the deliberate cultivation of uncertainty about one's true thoughts, capabilities, and intentions. While the weak self typically sought validation through the revelation of its accomplishments and insights, the self-mastered individual recognized that mystery itself was a form of power, keeping potential opponents off balance and unable to formulate effective strategies against unknown capabilities. The cultivation of strategic mystery required careful management of information flow. Every statement, every action, every alliance sends signals about one's position and intentions. The self-mastered individual learned to control these signals, revealing only what served his purposes while maintaining opacity in areas where mystery provided advantage. This approach extended to the management of one's reputation, which Lorenzo came to understand as a strategic asset that required careful cultivation and protection. Reputation was not about being universally liked, an impossible and ultimately counterproductive goal, but about being known for specific qualities that enhanced one's strategic position. The ideal reputation combined respect for one's capabilities with uncertainty about one's specific intentions, creating a situation where others had to take one seriously while remaining unclear about exactly what response to prepare. The third phase of understanding emerged as Lorenzo's position in Florentine society evolved from that of observer to participant in the highest levels of political and economic decision-making. This transition revealed new dimensions of self-mastery related to the responsible exercise of power and the long-term sustainability of influence. The temptations that accompanied power proved to be among the most severe tests of self-mastery. Success brought with it opportunities for indulgence, revenge, and the satisfaction of long-suppressed desires that could undermine everything that had been built through disciplined effort. Lorenzo observed that this was the point at which many individuals who had successfully conquered their weak selves in pursuit of power proceeded to lose everything by allowing that weak self to re-emerge once power was achieved. The pattern was depressingly predictable: initial success through self-discipline, gradual relaxation of that discipline as success brought apparent security, emergence of previously suppressed weaknesses, increasing vulnerability to manipulation and poor decision-making, and eventual downfall that appeared sudden to outside observers but was actually the inevitable result of internal deterioration. Understanding this pattern allowed Lorenzo to prepare for it. He recognized that achieving power was not the end goal but merely a transition to a new phase that required even greater vigilance and more sophisticated forms of self-mastery. The skills that had enabled him to acquire influence were not necessarily the same skills required to maintain and effectively exercise that influence over the long term. The exercise of power revealed the importance of what he came to understand as strategic restraint, the ability to refrain from using power even when one possessed the capability to do so. The weak self, when given power, typically used it excessively, creating resentment, resistance, and eventual opposition that undermined its position. The self-mastered individual understood that power was most effective when used sparingly and precisely, creating maximum impact with minimum expenditure of resources and political capital. This restraint was not weakness but rather the highest expression of strength, the confidence that came from knowing that one could act decisively when necessary while having the wisdom to recognize when action was counterproductive. It represented a level of self-mastery that went beyond controlling one's immediate reactions to encompass the strategic management of one's entire approach to influence and authority. Lorenzo also discovered that sustainable power required the development of systems and institutions that could function effectively even in his absence. The weak self typically created organizations that were extensions of its own personality, dependent on its constant attention and intervention. When such individuals were removed from their positions, their organizations typically collapsed or underwent dramatic changes because they had never developed independent capability. The self-mastered individual, by contrast, created robust systems that could function effectively with minimal intervention. This approach served multiple strategic purposes, it freed his attention for higher-level concerns, created resilience against attempts to undermine his position, and demonstrated the kind of competence that enhanced rather than threatened his reputation and influence. The creation of such systems required overcoming the ego-driven desire to be indispensable and, instead, focusing on the more sophisticated satisfaction that came from building something larger and more durable than oneself. This represented perhaps the ultimate expression of self-mastery, the ability to subordinate even the desire for personal recognition to the larger strategic goal of creating lasting influence and impact. As his understanding matured, Lorenzo began to see self-mastery not as a destination but as a continuous process of development and refinement. Each new level of success brought new challenges that required new forms of discipline and control. The principles remained constant, but their application became increasingly sophisticated as the stakes rose and the consequences of failure became more severe. He also came to understand that true self-mastery created a kind of invulnerability that went beyond mere resistance to external threats. The individual who had genuinely conquered his weak self became anti-fragile, not just resistant to stress and adversity, but actually strengthened by them. Challenges that would break others became opportunities for growth and development. Attacks that would destroy the weak served only to reveal and enhance the strength of those who had mastered themselves. This anti-fragility emerged from the combination of internal discipline and external adaptability that characterized the self-mastered individual. Internal discipline provided stability and consistency of purpose, while external adaptability allowed for tactical flexibility in response to changing circumstances. The result was a kind of strategic resilience that could survive and even benefit from almost any external pressure. The ultimate realization was that the destruction of the weak self was not a one-time event but an ongoing process that required constant attention and renewal. The weak self was not eliminated permanently but rather held in check through continuous vigilance and active suppression. This ongoing struggle was not a burden but rather the source of ongoing strength. Like a muscle that grew stronger through resistance training, the capacity for self-mastery grew stronger through constant exercise. Looking back over the years of observation, experience, and refinement, Lorenzo could see the truth of the principle that had first captured his attention in the misty streets of Florence: the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. Not because he becomes physically invulnerable or immune to external pressures, but because he eliminates the internal vulnerabilities that enemies rely on to achieve their objectives. External enemies could attack his resources, his reputation, or his relationships, but they could not attack his judgment, his discipline, or his strategic capability. These internal strengths were beyond the reach of external manipulation and formed the foundation for all other forms of power and influence. As long as these remained intact, everything else could be rebuilt, recovered, or replaced. The weak self, by contrast, remained perpetually vulnerable because it could be influenced through its own desires, fears, and emotional reactions. No external security measures could provide adequate protection for someone whose greatest enemy resided within his own character. No amount of wealth, military power, or political influence could compensate for the fundamental vulnerability that came from being at the mercy of one's own uncontrolled impulses. The philosophy that emerged from these years of observation and application was both simple and profound: control yourself first, and then the world obeys. Not through magical thinking or wishful hoping, but through the practical mechanics of power and influence that governed human interactions at every level of society. Self-mastery created competence, competence created results, results created reputation, reputation created influence, and influence created the ability to shape circumstances rather than merely react to them. Each step in this progression reinforced the others, creating an upward spiral of capability and effectiveness that could continue indefinitely as long as the foundation of self-mastery remained solid. The man who had conquered his weak self possessed something that could not be taken away by any external force: the ability to think clearly under pressure, to act decisively when action was required, to wait patiently when waiting served his interests, and to adapt flexibly to changing circumstances without losing sight of his fundamental objectives. These capabilities, once developed and refined, provided a form of security and power that was independent of external circumstances and therefore truly reliable. The world obeyed not because it had to, but because the self-mastered individual created conditions that made obedience the most rational response. Through his competence, reliability, strategic thinking, and controlled demeanor, he became someone others wanted to follow, wanted to partner with, and wanted to avoid opposing. Power flowed to him naturally because he had demonstrated the capacity to use it effectively and responsibly. This was the ultimate lesson of Machiavellian wisdom, that true power came not from the ability to force others to do one's will, but from the ability to create circumstances where others chose to align with one's objectives because doing so served their own interests. Such alignment could only be created and maintained by someone who had achieved complete mastery over his own nature and could therefore be trusted to act rationally and strategically rather than emotionally and impulsively. The destruction of the weak self was thus revealed to be not an act of self-denial or self-hatred, but rather an act of self-liberation and self-empowerment. By eliminating the parts of himself that created vulnerability, irrationality, and ineffectiveness, the individual freed himself to become everything he was capable of becoming. The weak self was not his true nature but rather an obstacle to the expression of his true nature at its highest and most powerful level. In the end, the principle proved its truth through its results. Those who mastered themselves gained mastery over their circumstances, while those who remained slaves to their weak selves remained vulnerable to every form of external pressure and manipulation. The choice between these two paths was available to everyone, but it required the courage to confront one's own weaknesses honestly and the discipline to systematically eliminate them over time. The world obeyed those who had earned the right to command through the demonstration of their ability to command themselves. This was not tyranny but leadership in its purest form, influence based on competence, respect based on demonstrated capability, and power based on the wisdom to use it effectively. Such leadership created stability, prosperity, and progress for all who were touched by it, fulfilling the highest purposes of human organization and cooperation. The man who destroyed his weak self had indeed made himself indestructible, not through the elimination of all vulnerability, but through the elimination of all unnecessary vulnerability. What remained was a human being operating at peak effectiveness, capable of achieving extraordinary results through the application of extraordinary discipline, and therefore worthy of the extraordinary influence and respect that naturally flowed to those who had earned them through the mastery of themselves.